In the winter of 1821, the Scottish Highlands lay under a silence so deep it felt as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Snow weighed heavy upon the pines, muffling sound, swallowing whole valleys into a white stillness that seemed eternal. The cold was not the sharp, fleeting chill of city streets, but the kind that pressed itself into stone, into marrow, into the bones of the land itself. The villagers of Glenroslin huddled near their peat fires, whispering prayers that the season would not claim another life. It was during such a morning, bitter and gray, that Margaret McTavish set out from her cottage. A widow in her 40s, weathered by years of Highland hardship, she walked the snow-packed path with the slow patience of one who had buried too much to fear the cold. She carried with her a basket, woven with care, filled with scraps for the chickens she kept. But she did not reach the coop, for at the edge of the wood, where the birches bent under snow's weight, she found a shape. At first she thought it a deer fallen in the storm, half covered in frost. But as she drew closer, her breath caught. It was a boy. He lay curled upon the snow, barefoot, his thin shirt stiff with ice, his skin pale as wax. His eyes were closed, lashes rimed with frost, lips tinged blue. She dropped to her knees, pressing her hand against his chest, expecting the stillness of death. But beneath her palm, faint as a candle nearly extinguished, she felt it, a heartbeat. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, scooping him into her arms. He was feather-light, his body stiff, but warmth still lingered deep inside him. She hurried back to her cottage, the snow crunching under her boots, her breath rising like smoke into the morning air. Inside, she laid him before the fire, wrapping him in blankets, her own shawl pressed against his trembling frame. Hours passed before his lips parted and sound escaped. But what Margaret heard was no language she knew, not Gaelic, not English, not French, nor Latin, nor anything the old widow had ever heard in her lifetime. The boy's tongue twisted in strange cadences, syllables sharp and fluid, rolling together like water rushing over stone. He spoke as if reciting, as if remembering. His voice rose and fell in haunting rhythms that made Margaret's skin prickle. Neighbors came when word spread. They crowded into the small cottage, faces flushed from the cold, their breath fogging the air. Each leaned closer, listening, frowning, shaking their heads. Not a soul among them recognized the language. Fishermen swore it sounded like the calls of seabirds on the cliffs. An old shepherd muttered that it was the speech of spirits. One woman crossed herself, whispering that the boy was cursed, but Margaret silenced them. "He is a child," she said firmly. "No curse sits upon him. He is flesh and blood, and I will care for him." For days she nursed him back from the edge of death. She spooned broth between his lips, warmed his hands with her own, and whispered prayers when the fever racked his small frame. Slowly, strength returned. His eyes opened, gray, deep, unsettling in their calmness. But still, when he spoke, it was in that strange, impossible language he gave no name. No tale of who he was, where he had come from, how he had come to lie half frozen in the Highland snow. Margaret asked him questions gently, coaxing, hopeful. But he only answered in that fluid foreign speech, his hands sketching shapes in the air as if they might help her understand. The villagers grew restless. Whispers spread of changelings, of fairy children left in place of the real, of omens sent to test the faithful. The parish minister came, stern and skeptical, his eyes narrowing as the boy spoke. "This is not the tongue of man," he declared. "It is the trickery of demons." But Margaret would not surrender the boy to superstition. She met the minister's glare with iron in her voice. "You call yourself a man of God, then act as one. Show mercy." In time, her determination wore down their suspicion. The villagers, though still wary, grew curious. They would gather at the cottage to hear the boy speak, his voice rolling in strange cadences that stirred unease in every heart. Some claimed the syllables echoed ancient hymns. Others swore they heard something like weeping woven between the words. But the boy was not content merely to speak. Given a scrap of charcoal, he began to draw. Upon scraps of parchment, on the rough boards of the cottage table, he scrawled shapes, figures, and symbols none recognized. Spirals, intersecting lines, towers that curved impossibly skyward. Margaret, watching him, felt both awe and dread. For the boy drew not with the hesitance of a child, but with the sure hand of memory. And so, what began as a chance discovery, a near-frozen boy in the Highland snow, began to unravel into something far stranger. Margaret McTavish had saved his life. But in doing so, she had opened a door. Word of the strange boy spread beyond Glenroslin as winter clawed its way into the Highlands. At first, it was whispers at the tavern, accounts of a child pulled from the snow who spoke no known language, whose voice rang with uncanny rhythms. Farmers carried the tale to markets, shepherds carried it over hills, and soon the story outpaced the frozen rivers themselves. By spring, it reached ears far beyond the village. But in those first weeks, Margaret alone bore the strangeness. Each morning she awoke to find the boy already awake, sitting near the hearth with a piece of charcoal clutched in his hand. His gray eyes stared into the embers as if searching for something beyond sight. When parchment was scarce, he scrawled upon the table, upon the walls, even upon his own skin when Margaret was not quick enough to stop him. The shapes he made unsettled her. They were not crude doodles. They were precise, spirals nested within spirals, triangles intersecting with arcs that suggested both pattern and purpose. Sometimes the drawings resembled towers, impossibly high, tapering toward the heavens with curves that mocked the laws of masonry. Other times they were maps, though not of any land Margaret had known. Coastlines bent at impossible angles, rivers cutting through cities that did not exist. At night, when she lay awake, Margaret heard him murmur in his strange tongue. Sometimes his voice was soft, as though reciting prayers. Other times it grew frantic, syllables tumbling in quick succession, his hands grasping at the air as if reaching for shapes invisible to her. In those moments she feared for him, or perhaps for herself, for she began to feel that she had not rescued a child, but invited an unknown presence into her home. By February, the minister's warnings spread. This was no ordinary boy. Some still whispered changeling. Others said he was cursed. But Margaret's defiance never wavered. He is a child, she repeated again and again. Whatever else he is still a child. When spring thaw loosened the grip of snow, visitors began to arrive. The first was Dr. Alistair M'Leod, a physician from Edinburgh, drawn by rumor and scholarly hunger. A stern man with silvering hair and spectacles perched upon his nose. He arrived with a satchel of instruments and the certainty of science. He observed the boy with the detachment of a surgeon studying a cadaver. He pricked his finger, measured his skull, peered into his eyes, tested his pulse. Physically sound, he reported to Margaret. Malnourished, yes, but no deformity, no impairment. Yet when the boy spoke, Dr. M'Leod's confidence faltered. He scribbled notes furiously, attempting to catch the structure of the language. Not Celtic, he muttered. Not Norse, not any Romance tongue. Not native to these isles nor to the continent. The cadence, 'tis like nothing catalogued. Still, he did not say the word that hung in Margaret's mind. Impossible. The second visitor was Professor Edmund Denore, a linguist from Glasgow. Where M'Leod was clinical, Denore was consumed by fascination. He listened to the boy for hours, tilting his head, his eyes widening as the cadences rolled forth. He began to mimic the sounds, awkwardly at first, then with a strange eagerness as though he believed fluency could be stolen by repetition. One night, Margaret awoke to find Denore and the boy kneeling by the fire, speaking back and forth in low voices. She could not tell if they conversed or if Denore merely repeated syllables like a crow mimicking a bell. But when she stepped into the room, the boy's gray eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she had not seen before. Recognition, as if, for the first time, someone had answered him. Soon after, Denore begged Margaret for parchment. He and the boy drew side by side, filling sheet after sheet with symbols. Denore compared them to ancient scripts, Ogham Linear B runes, but none matched. It is a language without a people, he whispered almost in awe. Or a people without a history. The third visitor came not of his own accord, but sent by the Crown. Colonel James Worthington, an officer in his 50s with a soldier's bearing, rode into Glenroslin with 2 men at his side. His orders, he declared, were to assess a matter of national curiosity. He listened as Margaret reluctantly told the tale. He listened again as Dr. M'Leod and Professor Denore argued over origins. Then he observed the boy himself. The child did not flinch under the soldier's gaze. He sat upright, his small hands folded in his lap, and spoke in his strange tongue with calm precision. Worthington's jaw tightened. He turned to his men. "This is not a village matter," he said coldly. "This is crown business," Margaret protested, her voice trembling with fear. "You will not take him." But Worthington was unmoved. "He is no orphan of yours, madam. He is an anomaly, and anomalies belong to the crown." The boy was taken that night, bundled into a carriage while Margaret wept at the roadside. The villagers watched in silence, unease gnawing at their hearts. Some muttered that perhaps it was best. Others shook their heads, fearing what it meant to put such a child into the hands of government men. As the carriage rattled away, the boy turned his head to the window. His gray eyes met Margaret's one last time. His lips moved, shaping words she could not understand, but the tone carried meaning enough. "Farewell." She stood in the road long after the carriage vanished into the fog. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting onto her shawl, and for the first time since she had found him, Margaret felt truly cold. The carriage carrying the boy rumbled southward, its wheels cracking through ice, its horses straining against the highland slopes. Colonel Worthington sat across from him, rigid as stone, his gloved hands resting on his knees. To his left, a young officer dozed, lulled by the rhythm of the road. The boy sat upright, eyes fixed on the window, watching as the mountains receded into gray mist. He made no sound, offered no struggle. Only once did he speak, whispering a string of words that curled in the air like smoke. Worthington frowned but said nothing. By the time they reached Edinburgh, the boy's presence had already stirred whispers in official circles. Worthington's report, delivered in a clipped tone before a table of civil servants, described a juvenile male of indeterminate origin, communicating in unknown tongue, engaged in compulsive inscription of alien symbols. He urged immediate study. The Crown agreed. The boy was lodged in an austere facility on the edge of the city, half infirmary, half laboratory. Its stone walls were cold, its corridors echoing with the clatter of boots. Physicians, linguists, and scholars passed through daily, summoned by curiosity or by command. Each was given leave to examine him, to question him, to draw conclusions. At first they treated him gently. They offered him food, clothing, warmth. He accepted these with calm indifference. When parchment and ink were provided, he filled them tirelessly with symbols, diagrams, and maps. Scholars hunched over his work, arguing furiously. Some saw fragments of Greek, others claimed hints of Phoenician. Still others insisted it was an elaborate hoax. But the boy continued, his hand steady, his gray eyes unblinking. Language was the greater mystery. Professors from Aberdeen to Oxford came to hear him speak. They recorded his syllables phonetically, searching for patterns. They compared his cadence to Arabic, to Sanskrit, even to the tongues of the New World, but none fit. The boy did not falter. He spoke in the same rhythm, the same structure, day after day, as though reading from some eternal script only he could see. As months passed, frustration hardened curiosity into cruelty. When he refused to answer questions in English, Worthington ordered him deprived of food for a day. The boy endured in silence, his lips moving in his strange language as if reciting prayers. When he refused to respond to commands, he was locked in a dark room without light. Still, he did not yield. One physician, Dr. Samuel Price, attempted to frighten him into compliance. He brought fire near the boy's drawings, threatening to burn them unless he revealed their meaning. The boy's eyes widened for the first time. He leapt forward, clutching the parchment to his chest, and spoke in urgent tones, his voice trembling with something between fear and fury. But the words, though full of passion, yielded no sense. It was then they realized, whatever else he was, the boy's devotion to his symbols bordered on sacred. One night, a guard claimed to hear sounds in the boy's chamber, not his strange tongue, but a chorus, as if many voices echoed his words. The man swore the air grew heavy. The lamp dimmed and a vibration trembled through the stone floor. When he reported it, Worthington dismissed it as fancy born of exhaustion, yet the guard never returned to that post. Meanwhile, Professor Dunore, who had first conversed with the boy in Glenroslin, wrote letters pleading for mercy. "You are not observing a subject," he insisted. "You are crushing a life. Language, however strange, is still human." His protests were ignored. The Crown had no patience for sentiment. By summer, the boy's health faltered. His frame, already frail, grew thinner. His hands trembled, though he continued to write. Physicians bled him, dosed him with tonics, applied leeches as though illness were to blame. None helped, and still when parchment touched his hands, he filled it with symbols. Towers, spirals, cities that did not exist. Margaret McTavish, far away in Glenroslin, never forgot. She wrote letters demanding his return, letters that went unanswered. She walked each morning to the edge of the wood where she had first found him, whispering prayers into the trees. The villagers told her to let him go, that he was not of their world, but she refused. "He is a child," she said. "He belongs to someone's heart, if not mine." In Edinburgh, the boy began to resist in ways subtle but unmistakable. He would cease speaking for days, his gray eyes watching silently as scholars grew agitated. When they pressed him, he replied with only a single word repeated again and again, its syllables like the toll of a bell. They could not translate it, but all who heard it felt unease, as if it carried meaning too vast for comprehension. Then came the incident that ended his study. One evening, a storm battered the city. Rain lashed the windows of the facility. Wind howled through the chimneys and the lamps flickered. The boy was left in his chamber with parchment and ink. When a guard checked at midnight, he found the walls covered. Every surface, stone, wood, even the floor, had been inscribed with symbols. Spirals, arcs, towers, maps, hundreds of them scrawled in frantic, fevered hand. The boy stood in the center, ink staining his fingers, his shirt, even his face. He spoke not to the guard, but to the walls, his voice rising and falling in the strange tongue, faster than it had ever been heard. The guard, shaken, claimed the air vibrated. The walls seemed to hum, and for a moment he felt as though the room itself had grown larger. Worthington was summoned. He entered with fury, ordering the parchment burned, the boy restrained. But when soldiers moved to seize him, the boy resisted for the first time. He screamed, not in pain but in power. His words burst forth like thunder and the lamps shattered. Darkness swallowed the chamber, broken only by the glow of lightning through the window. When light returned, the boy was collapsed upon the floor, unconscious, his body shaking with fever. From that night forward, he never spoke again. He lingered in silence for weeks, drawing less and less until his hands lay still. Physicians declared his condition hopeless. In early autumn, he died, his gray eyes closing for the last time. He was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city, his drawings archived, his existence reduced to reports stamped and filed in government cabinets. Colonel Worthington returned to London, his tone brisk in correspondence. "The matter is concluded," he wrote. The subject expired, but some who had seen the boy, the guard who heard the chorus, the scholar who mimicked his tongue, never forgot. They whispered of him in quiet corners, long after the crown sought silence. For Margaret, no word ever came. She waited each day by the wood, growing older, until the day she herself was carried to her rest. She never knew the boy's fate, but the story did not end in that grave. Though the Crown declared the case closed in 1821, whispers lingered. They moved like smoke through taverns, libraries, and chapels, clinging to those who had glimpsed the boy, those who had read his symbols, those who had listened to the language that no one could name. The official record was thin, a few pages stamped and filed, a handful of drawings catalogued in some anonymous cabinet. But memory lived where records were meant to erase. The first echo came not in Scotland, but in London. In 1825, a clerk named Jonathan Bell, tasked with organizing documents in the Office of Colonial Affairs, found himself unsettled by one folder. Within it lay drawings seized from the boy's chamber, spirals, towers, maps of places unknown. Bell had never seen them before, yet as he stared, his hand twitched. He realized, to his horror, that he was tracing the lines upon his desk without meaning to. Later, in the quiet of his lodgings, he caught himself humming a rhythm that was not a song, not a hymn, but a cadence, sharp and fluid, rolling as if from a tongue he did not know. He burned his notes and never spoke of it again. But he told a friend in confidence that the boy's language was like smoke, seeping into the lungs whether one invited it or not. More sightings came in fragments. A schoolmaster in Aberdeen reported a pupil who, without prompting, filled a slate with symbols identical to the archived drawings. When questioned, the child could not explain. He said only that the shapes arrived in his dreams. In Dublin, A nun tending to the sick claimed to hear a feverish patient muttering syllables in a cadence that chilled her blood. When pressed, the patient insisted he had no memory of the words. The nun described it to her superior, who silenced her with a warning: "Do not carry another man's curse upon your tongue." By the 1830s, the story of the Highland boy had taken on the shape of legend. Some said he was not a child at all, but an emissary of some forgotten race. Others claimed he was a demon in disguise testing the faithful. But those who had stood near him, Margaret McTavish, Professor Denore, even Dr. Mloud, knew better. Whatever he was, he had been alive. Flesh, blood, and sorrow. Professor Denore, shaken by his own encounters, spent decades trying to decode the drawings. He published a small volume in 1842, under a false name, On Languages Without People. In it, he compared the boy's tongue to no known family, concluding it was a relic without lineage, an alphabet without earth. His peers mocked him, but the book found strange readers. Men and women who claimed they, too, had heard the cadence in dreams. Copies circulated quietly, slipping into private collections and dusty shelves, never entirely vanishing. By mid-century, the boy's case had been largely forgotten by the public. But every so often, something stirred the memory. In 1859, a ship's log from a vessel returning from the Arctic recorded that one sailor, delirious with scurvy, scribbled symbols upon the deck with a piece of charcoal. The captain unnerved threw the planks overboard. Yet another crewman swore the shapes were identical to those seen in Dunouri's book. Closer to home in the Highlands themselves, Margaret's descendants told of strange visitors at her cottage after her death. Travelers stopped at the threshold, asking to see where the boy had been found. Some left offerings, scraps of parchment with spirals drawn upon them, folded carefully, placed beneath stones. One shepherd claimed he saw a pale child wandering near the birches on a fog-heavy night, barefoot, his eyes gray as ash. When he called out, the figure vanished into the mist. Fear clung to the edges of these stories. Parents told their children not to draw spirals, lest they invite the boy's tongue into the house. Fishermen warned each other not to whistle near the cliffs, for the rhythm of it might echo his speech. And though the ministers thundered from pulpits that such tales were pagan nonsense, even they paused when certain syllables reached their ears, their faces paling before they quickly composed themselves. In Edinburgh, the archive where the boy's papers were stored grew infamous among clerks. More than one claimed that the drawers containing his drawings were colder to the touch than any others. Some said the ink on the parchments never fully dried, smearing faintly no matter how carefully handled. By the 1870s, the collection was moved into restricted storage, not for lack of interest, but because those who handled it often fell ill with sudden fevers, muttering in their sleep. The language spread in other ways, too. Subtler, more insidious. A poet in Glasgow published verses that critics called unreadable, incoherent. But a linguist who had studied Dunour's book noted with unease that the rhythm of the stanzas matched the cadences of the boy's tongue. An architect in Manchester drew plans for towers with impossible curves, strikingly similar to the boy's sketches. He could not explain why he designed them so, only that the forms felt correct. The buildings, of course, could not be constructed. By the turn of the century, the boy's story had become a ghost tale told on winter nights. Children whispered of him as the snow foundling, a creature half human, half phantom. Some claimed to hear his footsteps on fog-heavy mornings. Others swore that if you stood alone at the edge of the woods where Margaret McTavish had found him, you might hear a child's voice reciting in a language you could not name. Yet even as folklore, the story unsettled. Too many details aligned across too many decades. The symbols, the language, the dreams, they recurred like echoes of a voice that refused to die. By the end of the 19th century, scholars began quietly referring to the case again. Some called it the Glenroslin child. Others, more superstitious, avoided naming it altogether. They agreed on only one thing. Whatever had been discovered in the snow in 1821 had not ended in Edinburgh. It had lingered. It had spread. And for those who had stood too close, it had never truly left. The turn of the 20th century brought new machines, new sciences, new promises of progress. But it also brought with it an insatiable hunger for the strange. Spiritualism flourished in drawing rooms. Seances echoed with whispers. Mediums scribbled messages from the beyond. And in this climate of obsession with the unseen, the boy of Glenroslin returned. He came not as a child of flesh, but as a shadow threaded through papers, rumors, and dreams. In 1904, the Royal Society of Antiquaries received an anonymous parcel. Inside were 7 sheets of parchment covered in spirals and towers. The ink was old but not faded, the strokes urgent and deliberate. A note accompanied them, unsigned, with only 5 words. "They are drawing again now." The sheets were filed under miscellaneous, but a young researcher, Thomas Rowe, recognized the shapes from Professor Dunour's obscure book. He brought the matter to his superior, who warned him to forget it. "That business is finished," the elder man snapped. "If you value your career, leave it buried." But Rowe did not forget. He began to see spirals in unexpected places, scratched into a bench in Hyde Park, chalked on the wall of a tenement, carved faintly into the wood of his own office desk, though he swore no hand had touched it. When he fell ill later that year, his fevered notes revealed stanzas of syllables that matched the cadence of the boy's language. He died before 30, his papers quietly destroyed. In the 1920s, as Europe reeled from war, the language surfaced again. Soldiers returning from the trenches told of comrades who, in their final moments, whispered words no one could understand. "Not French, not German, not Latin," one officer wrote. "Something older, colder. It made the air still." His report was dismissed as shell shock, but others spoke of dreams haunted by a gray-eyed boy standing in snow, reciting in a tongue that seemed to bend the night itself. The 1930s brought darker fascination. In Germany, occult researchers with government backing scoured archives for traces of lost languages. Among the papers they studied were copies of the Glenroslin drawings, obtained through channels best left unnamed. They mapped the spirals onto charts of the heavens, convinced they described celestial alignments. One report claimed the boy's symbols matched patterns seen in ruins half a world away. What they sought in him no one can say, but their search ended in fire and war. Yet the story endured. In 1951, a school teacher in Inverness discovered one of her pupils filling exercise books with unfamiliar writing. The boy, only 8, claimed he had heard it in the night. When she pressed him, he recited syllables that made her blood run cold. She recognized the rhythm, though she had never heard the Glenroslin tale in full. It was as if memory were speaking through him, she later confessed. The child grew silent after that, refusing to speak at all, and within a year he was gone. His family moved, his name lost, his fate unknown. The 1960s, an age of inquiry into altered states, pulled the legend into new hands. Researchers experimenting with psychedelics reported volunteers drawing symbols identical to the boy's spirals. Some claimed entire sessions were filled with utterances in a language no one present could identify. Recordings survive of men and women speaking in those cadences, their voices rising and falling with eerie familiarity. One researcher listening back whispered, "It is him. It is the same child, speaking through them." Archivists handling the boy's original drawings noted strange phenomena. One clerk reported the ink seemed darker when viewed at dusk. Another claimed the spirals, when stared at too long, seemed to move, faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though the parchment were breathing. Officially, these were dismissed as eye strain and imagination. Unofficially, the papers were moved again, deeper into restricted storage. By the 1980s, the Glenroslin boy had become a forbidden subject in certain circles of linguistics. A handful of professors insisted on presenting him at conferences as a case of unsolved xenoglossy, the ability to speak a language unknown to the speaker. Others dismissed it outright as myth, but even the skeptics faltered when shown the drawings. "They are too precise for invention," one admitted. "If they are a hoax without motive." Folklorists began collecting tales of sightings. A farmer claimed to see a barefoot child wandering the birches in winter, vanishing when approached. A mountaineer swore that at the summit of Ben Nevis, he heard a boy's voice carried by the wind, speaking words that froze his blood. A fisherman off the coast of Skye described hearing chants rising from the waves in the middle of the night, the cadence unmistakable. And still, the story persisted into the modern day. In the 1990s, the photograph of the Glenroslin drawings surfaced online for the first time. Scanned from a forgotten archive, the spirals spread like wildfire across forums dedicated to the paranormal. Users reported nightmares after staring at them. Some claimed their children, upon glimpsing the images, began to hum strange melodies. Others swore the drawings felt alive. By the dawn of the 21st century, the boy of 1821 had become more than legend. He had become contagion. His language, his symbols, his presence, they had slipped through time, carried by paper, by voice, by dream. What Margaret McTavish had lifted from the snow was not only a child. It was a thread, and once pulled, it had unraveled across generations. And if the whispers are to be believed, it has not stopped unraveling. The 21st century promised light, fiber optics, glowing screens, 1,000 voices stitched together across continents. Yet into this web of progress slipped the shadow of the boy, threading his way through code and pixels as easily as he once etched spirals onto parchment. What Margaret McTavish found in the Highland snow did not remain in Glenroslin, nor in Edinburgh, nor in the archives. It arrived here, with us, carried on the currents of our own obsession with the past. The first online discussions were almost dismissible. Grainy scans of drawings labeled unexplained Victorian scribbles, but those who lingered on them too long reported strange effects. Some claimed the symbols seemed to shift when viewed on backlit screens, spirals tightening, towers elongating in the corner of the eye. Others swore the images corrupted their files, multiplying in folders where they had not been saved. Forums filled with warnings. Do not download the Glenroslin scans, do not print them, do not trace the spirals. Of course, such warnings only fueled curiosity. Then came the recordings. Amateur researchers uploaded audio files, their voices repeating the syllables found in Dunour's notes. The cadence was halting, imperfect yet recognizable. Commenters described unease, as though hearing the language even imperfectly was enough to invite it closer. One user, after listening on loop, began to post messages in a strange tongue. When asked for translation, he claimed he could not. The words simply came. His account was deleted weeks later, but not before dozens admitted to dreaming of a gray-eyed boy standing in snow, lips moving in silence. In universities, young linguists rediscovered the case. Some dismissed it as pseudoscience, a curiosity better suited for ghost stories than lectures. Yet even they confessed the rhythms haunted them. "It sticks," one doctoral student wrote in a private blog. "You think you've forgotten, then it comes back in the shower, in the silence before sleep." The cadence returns like breath. Archivists, too, noted unsettling developments. The Glenroslin papers, long kept under lock, were digitized in the 2000s. During scanning, 2 separate technicians reported malfunctions. Machines freezing, images duplicating spontaneously, documents saved under file names they had not entered. When one technician opened a corrupted file, he found not a scan but a new drawing. Spirals that matched none in the archive, ink black against a blank screen. He left the project soon after, citing illness. The legend grew. Paranormal groups claimed the boy was no orphan but a messenger, perhaps even a remnant of some forgotten civilization. Conspiracy theorists insisted the Crown still kept his remains hidden, that experiments had not ended in 1821, but continued in secrecy. Others took a different view, that he was not of the earth at all, but a visitor, a being left stranded in the Highlands with only language and symbols to bind him to memory. But perhaps the most unsettling claim is the simplest, that the boy was and remains human, a child whose difference was never meant to be understood, only endured. That what Margaret McTavish carried from the snow was no demon, no angel, no alien, but a boy whose mind and tongue held something larger than the world around him, and that our fear, our hunger to explain, is what turned him into legend. Yet the echoes persist. Teachers still report children scribbling spirals on the margins of notebooks. Travelers still whisper of gray-eyed boys glimpsed in the fog of the Highlands. Online, the drawings circulate endlessly, copied and recopied until no one knows which are original and which are imitations. But does it matter? The symbols have become alive in repetition, like a song that cannot be unsung. They have entered us. And so, nearly 2 centuries after that morning in 1821, the boy has not left. He remains in stories, in drawings, in syllables murmured half asleep. He remains in the silence between words, in the strange rhythm that sometimes rises unbidden in the back of the throat. He remains in the spirals. Perhaps that is the lesson. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried, to unsettle, to remind us that the world is not ours to master. Margaret McTavish believed she had saved a child from death. Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she opened a door, and what walked through has never closed it again. And if, one evening, you find yourself humming a melody you cannot place, or your hand absently sketching spirals upon the corner of a page, pause. Look closer. Ask yourself whose memory has found you. The snow has not melted. The boy has not gone. He is still waiting, barefoot in the white silence, speaking a language we are only beginning to hear.